Alright, so audio's okay. I figured out a way to use my headset mic on this game too. I added the Firefox game so we can continue to listen to the nature of astrology. I don't exactly remember where we started off, so yeah, we'll save that part of the stream, but I won't save the other part really, because I might. Actually, I will. I usually always do. So, but I'll separate from the astrology part, so if anyone wants to listen to it again or whatever, can, or you can just look it up. I don't know, but like, it's whatever. So right now I have both Elgato and everything kind of working. So yeah, so it's gonna be, you're gonna have to get used to a little bit of the radio voice. I can't help that. So I mean, it's not bad. You can just tell it's not that great a quality of a mic. That's it, and that's fine. Because personally, until we can actually have money to invest in better stuff, this is probably the best option for me personally. Just because I move a lot, and it's really hard for me to sit still for long. You know, I have ADHD, so it's really impossible, and I'd rather be comfortable. I'm sorry. So yes, quality will be an expense for basically quantity, or for quality. Quality will be sacrificed for the expense of their comforts, because this is my stream and I can make my own roast. I don't have to do everything else. That's just kind of how it should be. But you know, because it's not like I get paid for this. Also, the connection might be a bit bad because I have it on unstable. So it's okay if no one can actually join it right now. I'm just ready to continue this. So I basically put where we last left off, and we're gonna listen to it while I stream. So yeah, so here goes.
Was the Goklan studies, and that's something that you spend time talking about at a few different points during the course of the book, and that it seems like you still think is relevant and needs to be part of the discussion today.
Oh yeah, I think that it was the most sustained, complex, and sophisticated astrological study so far, because he spent his whole life, and his wife was working with him. You know, Michelle and Francois Goklan, and it was rigorous. I mean, that study holds up to any great scientific study. I mean, there's a lot of garbage out there that's done, and that allows the FDA to make a drug legal. You know, but Goklan's is just as tough and tight, and more so than most others. And it's been challenged. You know, if you interviewed Ken Irving, you know all about it. I mean, he's over here. The Tenacious Mars Effect is the name of the book.
So this is Ryan
Pass. I guess I'm bringing it up because there was a lot of excitement surrounding Goklan's work and other attempts to do scientific studies on astrology like that, and kind of pick out one factor or a couple factors in astrology and you try to test it scientifically. But I feel like the astrological in the 1980s and 1990s with some of those studies where, for different reasons, things were not going as well as they hoped. Sometimes, occasionally through like underhanded means, like some other applications of the Goklan studies that were withheld or swept under the rug initially. And especially starting in the 90s, there's been a lot of reflections in the community about why this was, attempts to explain it, and the sort of decline in enthusiasm, and questions especially about whether that was even an appropriate way to attempt to validate astrology, so that you get the work of people like, you know, most notably Jeffrey Cornelius and his work, The Moment of Astrology, to explain why scientific tests of that sort, statistical tests primarily, might always be doomed to failure, or might not be an appropriate way to study the phenomenon of astrology. But it seems like in your book that's something where you don't agree with that viewpoint, and things have gone over the past 3 decades, and you try to push back on that to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with him in the sense that reductionism in testing astrology, you know, is at least initially it's not going to get the results. You know, so it's going to look bad for astrology, because in astrology you're testing a self-organizing system, and self-organizing systems, you know, or emergent systems resist quantification. They're very hard to test. So, you know, we're working with a difficult beast.
Oh, we don't know.
But there are some openings, and it depends on refinement. Like, for example, there was the NCGR suicide study, and so they got a lot of charts of suicides, people that committed suicide, and they tried to see what was common with them, and they tried everything. You know, they threw the kitchen sink at it, Uranian, astrology, everything, and they didn't really come up with anything that was statistically significant. Now, my take on that was that, there's different suicides for different reasons. And sure enough, when I was working on this book, I came across this paper that somebody wrote on a study of suicide ideation, like the correlation between suicide and what is generating the suicide showed some statistical significance with, one set of reasons rather than another. So, to me, I don't remember the details offhand right now, but, to me, that's like a lot of sciences. You have to start refining your sample set. Gauquelin got results because he didn't take all athletes. He took athletes that were good. And then he had to find some way of saying how they were good, so they had to have, scored in major competitions or be listed in books or whatever. And that was, checked by Earl and a number of others, and it worked. So that's called extreme sampling. And so you do have to do that. There are people that are doing it.
Yeah, so the point was that the phenomenon showed up in the charts of eminent athletes, not just any old athlete. But then there became a argument around what constitutes eminence and whether there's subjective issues in terms of deciding who's eminent versus not.
But that happens in doing any kind of social science. I don't think astrology's subject matter is complex, but so is psychology's, because it's almost the same. And, psychology has all the institutions, and it's aligned itself with the medical field, so it's got that advantage. And so, they're working on these personality inventories, and, mostly they're self-created. The studies here they have as hard a time of testing their subjects as astrologers, but they're not astrology. Astrology's...
That sucked. I was hoping I could trick him, but he was way too strong. At least I'll end up being there, so it didn't really help. No, I have to go over again. That's annoying. Okay, give me a second, y'all. I just hate that. I have to go all the way back and redo all this BS. I sorry, we weren't listening, were we?
Because it interferes with fate and free will. Physicists don't like it. There's a lot of prejudice towards it. So astrologers, they do 10 times as much work to get any kind of attention. Meanwhile, Gauquelin study stands there. It's like a giant edifice in the field of astrology. It's a big building, and they don't want to look at it. Still goes on. There's still arguments pro and con, but I think it's pretty solid.
Right. I think I wrote down a sentence that you wrote at one point later in the book where you said, "It should be obvious by now that astrology does not lend itself to reductionism because it does not study easily reducible phenomena."
Yeah, self-organizing systems are in motion. It's hard to you got to take out, you got to take one shot at it and take one piece of it. Well, like what I did with the weather. I explained it, traditionally Saturn and the weather. And you got to remember that the people that were, on the side here, the people that were doing astrometeorology are using the same techniques as the people that were making charts. Right?
Yeah, that gets into some complicated stuff in terms of weather prediction and things like that.
But they all... I was going to say, they all agreed Saturn was cold, dark, damp, not good. And I took one of those, qualities, and then I got daily temperature data. And I ran it again. In this case, as I mentioned before, the Sun-Saturn opposition, and lo and behold, I got a result. that was pretty consistent. So that's reductionism applied to a system, but it doesn't have that much to do with free will, so it's not earth-shattering.
Yeah, well, and I was thinking, like, the Goklan studies are a better example of that, to the extent that you're talking about isolating one factor, which is like Mars, and what sector of the chart it's in, essentially, and whether it's especially rising or culminating at the midheaven.
Yeah.
But you're focusing on just that one factor in isolation of everything else, which is hard because that's not usually how astrologers operate when looking at charts, but instead they're looking at the totality of the chart and how the alignments of the planets it sort of alter the expression of different planets based on how each of the planets in the chart is aligned relative to each other.
Yeah, astrology is synthesis. You know, you're blending things, and it's done intuitively like an artist does. That's why the practice of astrology is not a science, it's an art. But astrology is a subject, and it has a component, like other subjects do, that could be called theory and research, and they could be separate, or they could be working together, or whatever, but that could produce a science. That's what has happened with psychology.
Yeah, that's one of your primary contentions, is that you think that someday astrology will be validated as a science.
Yeah, you know, they may not, you know, like, you know, people really didn't understand the mechanisms of evolution when Darwin, you know, published, you know, he knew that there was variation, but he didn't know how the variation was produced. His theory of evolution, you know, that came later. You know, ironically, it was coming at the same time Gregor Mendel was like working out inheritance with his studies on peas, but it really wasn't until another 50 years where that got integrated with evolution, and then it became neo-Darwinism. So, you know, similar things could happen with astrology. You can build up some model that works pretty well and then start filling in the details later as you get to it.
Yeah, but I would just, in terms of response to that last question, like, that was kind of a non-yes. It's actually a much more strongly affirmative answer with personal view on that. I do strongly believe that astrology will be validated scientifically at some point, as opposed to saying, like, astrologers such as Cornelius who say no, that's actually not going to happen because there's something about the intrinsic nature of astrology that makes that not possible.
Yeah, I don't agree with him at all. I mean, there's a lot. He says a lot of interesting things. You know, I read the book and I got a lot out of it, but I disagree. I think that, you know, calling it divination is easy and it solves the problem for the time being. But I think that there's a lot of reality to astrology. You can see it working, you know, and it's affecting other self-organizing systems like weather. And I'm going to test it myself. And, you know, Goklan tested natal astrology by noting, you know, significant correlations in the diurnal cycle of the planets, you know, which we call the houses in astrology. Of course, he called them Goklan sectors. He used 12, 18, and 36, or something like that, 24. He used different sectors, you know, depending on what the study was. But I think that as time goes on and astrology begins to build better institutions, or institutions in the first place. I mean, what do we have? A few schools and a few organizations. That's about it, right? Yeah. So maybe some billionaire will come along, you know, start something up. Who knows? I don't know. You know, and if you read carefully, I'm talking in terms of centuries, really. I'm not saying this is going to happen, you know, in the next 20 years, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, you actually have to spend the entire last chapter. It was an interesting contrast to early in the book you said about some of the diciness with making predictions, but you spend a large part of the last chapter actually making some predictions about the future trajectory of
Sorry, I turned off the mic because I still feel like it's going to capture my audio, but I don't know why. It just seems like it is. But what is this? I have no idea. Like, Sage's will? Are we going to find that out? Maybe it's something we'll figure it out later. Or maybe it's something to do with, I don't know. It looks like it's a collectible. Interesting. Anyway, sorry. I was just doing that.
astrology and the astrological community, just based on your observations of what actually seemed like, when I was reading it, like a very interesting and perceptive set of observations about the astrological community and the type of people in it, and a sort of realistic projection, although sometimes idyllic or like best case scenario projection about where astrology could end up in the future and its place in society based on certain things that astrologers might do now.
Yeah, I'm not, let me be clear and say I'm not making, and you know this, that I'm not making an astrological prediction about where astrology is going to be.
Right.
I'm just making, some comments and observations, maybe supported by some ideas that I've gotten from studying history. And I do see astrology as a legitimate subject that's about 300 or 400 years behind the other subjects. Maybe not quite that, maybe 300 is about right. And so it has not gone through its,
Interesting he says 300 to 400, because what's interesting about this comment, and he may even iterate this because I haven't heard this part, but I'm just going to comment now before he says something that might sound like something else. But this is just a different thought, and maybe he won't talk about it, but Vedic astrology and other forms of astrology in the Eastern world have been developed for thousands of years. Astrology, I've mentioned before, has not had that luxury due to colonialism and the crusades of Christianity and stuff, and just a mixture of a lot of other things, like, no hard proof from the science community, mostly put the nail to the coffin. But I did think about this that isn't really thought of. I think there's a general bias against things that are part of something that are not part of the logics behind the people who were the center of thought back in those days. Now, there's no proof of this. I have no documentary of this. I can't travel back in time. But this is just an observation based on the behaviors of human beings and just in general thinking about history and just in overall. So just take this as a grain of salt in a way, but unless there's some concrete proof where I can't really say for sure. But in my assumption is that I think a lot of things having to do with that, with astrology not having validity in the Westerns, due to the fact that it's, mostly ruled by the Western world, who were very much against anything that was othered to their own belief system that they themselves had determined was the truth. And so they themselves denounce anything feminine, anything gay, anything just non-Christian Abrahamic religion. And they were biased to what they thought was true based on what they found. And because of that, their focuses on those studies became central, and so thus they were allowed to develop. The thing is, back in the day, most people only studied or got validity when you got enough people kind of on board with that. And if you were rich and interested in these type of stuff, then yeah. Now, fate and also stuff was used for a lot of astrology. That they mentioned this before in the podcast, and I think that was what the Protestants didn't like, because fate was kind of more Catholic built in a sense, where we're fated for da. But what's funny is that they too kind of put themselves in some sort of fate ideal, but only with the afterlife, because they didn't want the idea of someone telling what to do, but they also wanted to tell people what to do. But Catholics were the same way, so they were just the other side of the snake coin that they all shared, both Catholics and Protestants. And it annoys the crap out of me when they separate themselves, when they're literally the same damn thing. Christians are the same damn thing. Don't let them fool you. Yes, they might interpret the Bible a bit differently, but it's the same damn thing. And they just have their own interpretation that they want to believe is true, get enough people to think and be on board with that, and thus I think that also put it out to astrology as well. And they mentioned this too, but it all kind of comes down to, biases that we've already shared and our ancestors shared too. There could be a lot of truths to this world that we will never know because, people weren't interested in learning. And it could have been the very thing that we needed to solve a certain puzzle. And that's what developing truths and stuff, the Sagittarius themes are all about. They're all about us finding the truth, but not exactly finding the absolute truth, because there's no absolute truth in this world. or at least as far as we know. And that's really hard for a lot of people to handle. They want absolutes. They want the world to be black and white. They want life to be predictable. They want people to be in boxes. Why? Because it's easier in survival instincts. We're still very much embody the energy of animals who are constantly, like, if you think about like a squirrel on a tree, it loves being on a tree with its nuts and blah, blah, blah. Well, what if something like a cat jumps on that same tree one day to get it and it managed to survive? Will it go back to that tree? Maybe not. It may be even more cautious after that, experiencing something attacking them. It takes only one incident for you to be cautious. This is also true with us as humans when it comes to things that we are not familiar with or unknown. And one bad experience can almost determine its truth for us. Like, oh, because of this happens. And, you know, that is somewhat true. We subconsciously do that because, like animals, we do whatever we can. Any, like, something that goes against what's keeping us safe, we must protect ourselves to a certain extent. Now, of course, we've developed the consciousness more often than not. So it's more physiology now that attaches itself in that sense. So I just find that all very fascinating because, if anything, we're all kind of just lying to ourselves about what the true truth is. Obviously science has more credibility in this sense because they have a diplomatic way and not diplomatic, but maybe more democratic way, like Bruce says, that of testing things to make sure, and that enough people who have expertise and who have done the same tests is also in validity to the same results. And thus it can be a theory. But there's always a chance, and the science community knows this very well, that something could come around and disprove that. And so as humans, we need to be open to that. But I think the problem is most humans don't like being proven wrong. And so I feel like this Pluto-Aquarius transit is going to really test the science community quite a bit when it comes to what's right and what's wrong. Now, will that make validity for more astrology? I don't know. Now, that could be more when Pluto goes into Pisces, which by then, that will be my last bit of my lifetime. Will be like, I think after my Saturn return, or my second one. And and I might very well live to see astrology get its validity before I die. That would be nice to know. I don't think I'm going to live past Pluto going past my 12th house, but I certainly am going to try to live past to see at least Pluto in Pisces. I want to live at least that long. I probably will. I'll probably at least live till Pluto in Aries if that comes to it. But for the most part, I think I'm going to live until at least through all of Pluto and Pisces and partial Pluto of Aquarius. Maybe once it hits my ascendant, I'll be dead. So, but it is what it is. But I think it's because I'm a 12th house person. I'm okay with death. I'm fascinated by death, and I'm obsessed with it. I love the thought of endings and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm a weirdo. So I've been like that even before all my trauma. So I was always fascinated by death. I used to be embarrassed to admit that because people had noticed it. And I was like, no, I'm not. Because I thought that would be weird. But then over time, now that I've expressed myself and accept myself, like, no, I am. I'm going to admit that I am. I've always been fascinated by the afterlife and what the truth behind it. I'm fascinated by the idea of what will happen when I die. It doesn't scare me at all. Probably why I was more involved into the suicide ideology back then, because I wasn't as afraid of death as back then until I have to face it, or the possibility of the pain of it, because that's different. Death itself isn't scary, but the pain of death and pain going through an end is a different experience. And obviously someone who wants to live, someone who has a desire to live, will not fear that. And so, he's right about suicides not all being the same, because my suicide is different from someone who did actually commit suicide in general. So they were done with life because they were sick of how horrible it was, and they didn't see any way out because they didn't have a support system or had anyone that really gave a shit about them. But so I can understand why that happened. They weren't really supported by the people around them. So yeah, I know that sounds really horrible, and I'm sure people who have lost loved ones from suicide would not like hearing that, but it's pretty much the truth. Like, I'm sorry that hurts your feelings, but I'm not here to cater to your feelings. I'm just telling you, my idea of why people commit suicide. For me, it was more like I thought I had to, because I thought the voices in my heads were right and that they should be dead, even though I didn't want to die. And so I attempted because I thought it was best for everyone. that was a delusion. That was a Neptunian influence delusion that went through from my 12th house sphere, because I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't understand that, my 12th house perfection year is still like by far the hardest year, and it's a year I'm really like forbidding on, even to now. Like I'm in my 9th house, I'm kind of like at a square to it right now, and it's like this is why I'm taking my perfection years a lot more seriously, even though I haven't even done my SR report. I'm sorry, but I feel like I need to be in the right mindset to do it. I can't just force myself to do it. I have to be. Unfortunately, when I was gonna do it, I got extremely sick and was sick for a whole 2 months. It wasn't until now that I wasn't. And my assumption was why that happened like that. The reason it happened was because I was going through a transformation. I was unmasking, and it was very traumatic for me because I had been becoming someone I didn't want to be. I was being what I thought everyone wanted to be, but was like secretly something else, the chaotic self outside. And when those two sides completely contradict yourselves, which is very...
Which is in the nature of, sorry, it went off because the sound went off, so that's why. But it's within the nature. Oh my god, I lost my train of thought when this happened. I'm kind of like in this awkward situation. Let me see if you can hear me still. You still hear me? Oh, you can't hear me now. I can't hear it because I don't have my thing on. So give me a second. Let me listen to it real quick so I can continue what I'm saying. All right. So, yeah. How do I sound now? Alright, I sound okay. So I'm only going to keep it on the forcip for just a moment, real quick. But what I was saying is that I think it's important to... Oh fuck, I still forgot what I'm saying, so I'm trying to remember real quick. But what I'm trying to say... That really missed me up. I don't know! I wish I could reach back, but I think there's a way you can, but I don't remember. So we were talking about... Let me try to retrace what I was talking about. We were talking about, suicide and how my reasoning behind it and was different from someone who actually did have a shit life, didn't have the support, and then they actually did it, versus me who had a delusion that I had to because I didn't quite see. I think it's because the pain of things or the ideas of stuff not working out was too much for me, and I was pushing myself to my absolute human limit to what I am now, and that was really, really, really painful for me in general. And so that ended up getting me to these grand illusions because, again, I had MDD and was like not facing reality, and created that sort of environment where I would hear those voices or have that sort of situation. And because I was so sick the past few months, is because I'm actually unmasking them. And it actually caused a visceral reaction from my body. And also because it was the end tail of the flu season as well. And I hadn't taken a flu shot in a long time, so I think it overall is a bunch of things, not just one thing at a time, but just overall a bunch of stuff that kind of collected together. And this is just an assumption on my part that I just found, because I tend to come up with ideas based on the circumstances surrounding it at the moment. Because yes, that was when I was starting therapy, and I was going through a huge transformation of letting go of a lot of stuff, and my body indirectly was reacted to that, which only furthered the fact that, I was already emotionally irregulated, so I was more prone to getting sick, more prone to a lot of crashes, a lot more meltdowns, and thus I was in the tail end. So when I started trying to get it back together, my body was still in that situation, and even though I was doing a lot better, I still was getting sick, because it's not like suddenly you have this realization of life and you're like, oh, happy, suddenly your sickness is going to go away. The sickness is always there. It was always going to be part of there, regardless if I went to therapy or not. In fact, I probably would have been sick a bit longer. So it was the longest I've been sick for a really long time. It seems like every year me being sick is getting actually longer. It used to be where I would get sick maybe once or twice a year. Then I went to the 3 to 4 times a year. Now it's up to about half the year I'm sick. And this was by far the longest I've been sick at one time. 2 months. That is just insane. There was only maybe a week of where I was okay, but like I was still sick. That's not everything. I just kept getting more and more sick. And it was around the time I was going through my therapy and trying to heal and reconcile for a lot of things that I've done and have been done to me. And so I think in a way, it did have a visual effect. Took me a while, but I continued to keep trying to regulate myself. Keep at it despite not seeing results right away. Because I know that not everything can just change out of nowhere. I learned that from like eating disorders and just in general trying to get my health back together in the past and during a 6 health perfection year. It takes a lot more effort than just doing something once and then hoping things change. That's not how it works, man. You have to get your whole body in gear towards it. It could take months to years to get used to that. That's why I always tell people who are trying to lose weight, who see like what I've done, I've lost enough weight to, say this, is that no, it took me 3 or 4 years to get to where I'm at. And I'm not even at the ideal weight I would have liked in the past. But I've learned to accept my body for what it was because I'm fine. I don't need to be sexy with abs and blah, blah, blah. Who am I trying to impress, huh? That's why people do it, to look aesthetically pleasing because they like to look good and be desirable. But I'm not like that at all. I confuse desirability with respect. And that's two things that can kind of come together, but they don't necessarily are the same thing. So obviously they're different definitions. But we tend to sort of conflate the two terms without realizing it, and I realized that's what I was doing. So instead I was like, you know what, I like the way my body is now. I like the way I look. I might not be the best looking person, I might be the ugliest, whatever, who cares? I still don't like to show my face because I hate how my face looks though. I'm not at that level. I'm not like, oh, I'm fine the way I am, I'm gonna show my face because no, it's more like I'm fine the way I am. I'm not the best looking person, I'm not the ugliest. I'm still a bit self-conscious, yeah, because I don't like to look at my face. So obviously that's not completely true, because I'm not at the point where I accept looking at it, but because I freaking do a weird mouth thing when I'm like streaming. I hate looking at myself doing that, so that's literally the only reason why, and I'm just embarrassed by it too, due to, ableism and, all that stuff, just because I don't know how to control my face. I was never really taught. I just do really random shitty faces. It's no wonder people think I'm fucking weird. And that's okay, because that's just how I am, and I can't really stop from people thinking that. Why do I need to worry about it? It's not like they gave a shit about me to begin with. But for them to make that comment, pretty much is them just judging me. Me doing anything else, they would judge me on that too, whether negative or good. And so people are entitled to their opinions, yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it should be the truth of what I am, because that's their only observation. That's not a truth. That's just an observation. So yeah. Anyway, we'll go back to what we were listening to in a minute, so that way we can listen to it. So yeah.
Significant revolution like biology did, or geology did, or physics. These subjects have gone through these big revolutions and they've become changed and organized. And I think that conditions have just not been right for astrology, because astrology is the subject that studies, analyzes, and maps self-organizing systems. And self-organizing systems are relatively recently recognized as a distinct phenomena. Systems that have emergent properties, these are not easily reducible. So that's why astrology is behind, one of the reasons why astrology is behind the times on, having a revolution that would allow it to be better organized as a subject. And I also want to make perfectly clear that I'm not concerned with astrology being accepted by the rest of the world. Oh, look at that. I have a transiting Saturn on my Mercury now, so I guess my image, video image just freezes from time to time.
It's fine, it'll go away in a month.
Yeah, it'll go away. Just wait long enough with Saturn, right? There we go. We're back moving again. But that, over time, astrology, if it improves and gets serious about itself and gets organized, will just become recognized. It doesn't have to prove itself to some authority. It just has to get tighter, better. And you can't have a free-for-all, and you can't have a situation in astrology where getting astrologers to cooperate is like herding cats. And the reason why is because in order to make a living at astrology, you have to have a little business. You have to be, an entrepreneur, a sole proprietor. And you have to do a lot of things. Now you have to know the internet, and you got to be a broadcaster, and, you have to publish. You have to do all these things. I mean, I've had to do them. I feel I was fortunate to live a lot of my life before the internet. I don't know, maybe I would see it different if I was born later, but I see the internet as like a bit of a nightmare.
I don't know. I could see you being a big hit on TikTok right now. Possibly might consider that at some point. Could be good.
Well, maybe. I'm spending most of my time just trying to keep my health going.
Yeah.
Lead a ritualistic daily routine of little exercises and so on, just to keep the whole system going. Don't have a lot extra. I felt sad. I sold my old skis the other day. I hadn't used them in a long time. Sorry to see that go. But anyway, yeah, I think that, getting back to the subject, I think that if astrology internally improves itself, that will make such a difference. The subject will be better recognized by others, but who cares? It'll make it on its own. It'll show itself that it can be a subject and it can contribute to the conversation.
Right.
Astrology is not really contributing now to the world in any significant way, and I think it should. It has a lot to say, a lot to offer.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I definitely, in the last chapter of the book, you really focus, while you spend a good deal of time talking about external pressures and issues that have kept astrology relegated to the fringes of society for the most part, especially in intellectual circles. You also spend a good deal of time talking about like some of the internal issues in the astrological community and areas where we kind of need to clean up our act and get it together as a community in order to take astrology into the next level or into the next era.
Yeah. Well, astrology operates as an outsider bubble. It's a bubble culture. It has its own rules and regulations, and when you get in those situations, it's really a survival crisis of a collective. And you help yourself along, and everybody's an astrologer. I'm an astrologer. What does that mean? You decided you're an astrologer, right? I'm a professional astrologer. I make some money. How much money? You make a living at it, or is it part-time? Is your spouse, covering you, or what? It's just not clear. It's a free-for-all. And you can go on and on for a while with a free-for-all, but it doesn't really work in the long run. And so, in the meanwhile, it's a cultural bubble. It's isolated. And it's still recovering from the, centuries of attacks from the church and ostracism by, physicists and skeptics and so on. It's in bad shape, and so it needs some work. It needs some focus, some agreements on how best to proceed to develop astrology as a subject that can contribute to the global conversation on what is nature, what is life, how do things work. And,
So one of your points was that because astrology fell out of the universities, and because it's a largely unregulated field at this point, while there was a push in the 80s and 90s to do some certifications of astrology in order to set some standards, that there needs to be more of a push towards that, because otherwise there's no way to distinguish between who's like a good practitioner of astrology or one that is either ethical or skilled or other well-educated, other things like that, versus somebody who just started studying astrology like a week ago and started calling themselves an astrologer right away or something like that.
Yeah, I think that there's no perfect solution. let me just be clear about that. There's no perfect solution, but testing, education and testing is probably the best option available, and other subjects have done that. So when you go to see a doctor, you want to see a doctor that went to med school. And although the medical field produces certified doctors, not all of them are that good. There's a range of difference, but at least it prevents the quacks from holding a position. It's a sorting out mechanism. It's an establishment of some kind of standards. I'm saying that some set of standards is better than none. For multiple reasons, one of which is better for the astrological community because it will allow institutions to grow, which will then allow astrology to progress and develop itself. I don't believe astrology is perfect as it is. I think astrology is a work in progress.
Right, but that something like that, while even though if we had better certification and better standards of astrology, that just like any other field or other disciplines, there's going to be a range of different practitioners in terms of their level of skill at their job or what they do, as well as their ethics or other things like that. It would at least give some baseline for when people try to do studies like the Vernon Clark studies, where they're trying to get together a group of skilled practitioners of astrology and have them match charts in a controlled setting, because in a test like that you want to know and be able to have some sort of distinction between who's a practitioner of this subject or a skilled practitioner versus who's not.
Yeah, I think if you're doing like a Vernon Clark type study now, what you would do is you would select the people you were testing to have say some level of astrological certification plus some number of years of practice, and then you'd be more likely than not to get people that knew what they were talking about.
That would increase certainly the things. There's definitely other things you could maybe add on top of that I think I'd like to see in terms of standardization if astrologers were to start engaging in tests like that again. That actually raises an issue that I've been having, which I'm kind of nervous about, which is going back to the observation I've made where I feel like in the past decade the skeptic community has kind of fallen apart and kind of decline in the leadership, sometimes due to the loss of major leaders like James Randi, who were at the center of things for several decades, or in other instances through the sidelining of some of those figures due to like social issues and different politics and things like that. But I'm a little nervous that the current generation of astrologers who came in this huge influx or this huge wave into the community over the past few years has so little experience dealing with the more militant sort of variety of scientific skepticism, that they're going to be a little caught off guard and a little underprepared for how to deal with some of those arguments compared to people back in the 80s and 90s where that was like a more common thing that you had to deal with like more frequently.
Maybe. I don't know for sure because I haven't really been all that active in astrology in the last 10 or 20 years, really. I've kind of stayed, kept one foot in it, but I was doing other things and had my own health problems. But I think it should be part of any kind of astrological education, an understanding of criticisms of astrology. That should be a course, a required course, in my opinion.
For sure, or doing research to understand some of the different studies that have been done in the past and some of the pros and cons for those studies. Like when it comes to like the Gogolin studies or the Vernon Clark trials or other things like that, like having done maybe like a literature review of some of that stuff.
Yeah, and people have written things about it. There was an article called Debunking the Debunkers that's stirred them all up. Valerie Bourne is the author of that. And, there's a history of arguing between astrologers and the skeptics. And if somebody could put all that together, that would be a great book right there, a great document, and very usful for people new in astrology. so that they would understand what the criticisms are and what the responses are.
I mean, is arguing with skeptics fundamentally productive? Because I feel like
No, it isn't.
there's a tendency sometimes early in one's studies of astrology to have that motivation to feel to like want to defend it more and to get into some of those arguments, but then eventually later on, sometimes not always, people mellow out or realize that sometimes it's not productive or that it's a waste of time, and maybe don't engage in that as much.
It's a waste of time to argue with these people most of the time. But I think what would be great is a collection of arguments between skeptics and astrologers in a book, but written by somebody who has, a sociologist, for example, or a psychologist who would really be able to analyze where these people are coming from and what the argument means in a larger context. Various arguments, maybe historical connections to them, and so on. Yeah, that would be interesting. I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that astrologers would benefit from, being able to step out of the bubble and see, okay, there's an argument going on with this one group, and we know that it's just a waste of time to argue with them because, they have a positivist philosophy and they're not going to really budge on it. But let's look at it in perspective. What is it? What does it say about our culture? What does it say about, who's in charge and who's making definitions? And what does it say about astrology's strengths and weaknesses? These are the kinds of things that the astrological community could learn from.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ability to look at astrology critically has always been one of the major hallmarks of some of the greatest figures in the history of astrology, and the greatest astrologers, and the ones who made the greatest contributions to the understanding of the theory and philosophy and the way that astrology integrates with science and the natural world. And that's often a tension within those figures, like the Ptolemy type figures or the Kepler figures, where on the one hand, they can sometimes be highly critical of certain parts of the astrological tradition that they view as not valid or that doesn't work, or superstitious stuff that they want to reject and set aside, versus in other parts of astrology that they view as valid or useful or effective in some ways to retain. And that's what Kepler's famous, don't throw out with the bathwater phrase.
Yeah. Also, Francis Bacon had a good deal on say on astrology and what should be thrown at, what shouldn't. But people have done this. People talk about it in science. Nobody's really done it. The distinction between astrology theory and astrology practice, comes into play here. The practice, follows its own path. Just like, medicine does, a lot is determined, on the fly through, experience. And then it kind of gets back to the research area and they test it out and find out what might really be going on. But we don't have that in astrology. We just have the practice. And it moves at its own pace. But what we need is to have some way of organizing what's being learned, capturing it. These days we have some really good practitioners. Eventually they write a book and learn something about it. But
that used to be part of the role of the astrological organizations, and I feel like that's something that's changed recently. Issue with the community is that the astrological organizations are struggling to find relevance and to stay relevant in contemporary times. One of the things that they did was a service previously, prior to the internet, that this was a very important feature of the community, was have journals and publications so that there was centralized almost repository for publishing astrological research or for having discussions in the community. But that's one of the things that with the rise of the internet that's almost become less relevant or useful, and it's one of the ways that the organizations are kind of struggling to reinvent themselves in the early 21st century.
I don't know if I would agree with that. NCGR, for example, has continuously published a journal. They had a magazine and a journal, Geocosmic Journal, and what was the other one? There was two of them that came out. Now it's just down to one a year. And they publish articles. Some of them are quite good. Scott Silverman edited one on newly discovered bodies, hyperbolic objects and things like that. And I thought it was pretty good. People wrote some pretty good articles about it, talking about their experience. The problem is that if you're a practitioner, you don't have the time and probably not the knowledge to do, a first-class reductionist science experiment on astrology and publish it. So the organizations, even though they may have been formed around the idea of doing that, International Society for Astrological Research, National Council for Geocosmic Research, that's what they wanted to do, but the reality is nobody's got the time or the knowledge to do it. It's just too hard to do without some kind of support. I was worked at the university for a long time, and I know what that's about. You go begging to the National Science Foundation or somebody else to get money, and then you get $100,000. Then half of that goes to the university, and then now you've got $50,000 to work for a year on your project, or however long it might be. That's how you get stuff done. We don't have anything like that in astrology.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess that's part of my point, is that the astrological organizations are nonprofits that are largely run by unpaid volunteers,
Right.
whose numbers have declined drastically over the course of the past few decades. And the contributions to those journals are just from whatever's available, and most
Membership.
of the time,
They're from membership, largely.
yeah, from membership. But then the membership is largely just practitioners who are not necessarily researchers in the sense of these aren't primarily like scientific journals at this point.
No,
They're
they can't be.
right,
Because the
'cause
astrologers don't know how to do reductionist science, and the subject's too hard to test. And there's no support for it. Give somebody $100,000, that really knows astrology, and they might be able to come up with a good test. And it might take them a couple of years, and then they make $50,000 a year.
And I think that was part of your point at one point about conferences as well, which is that oftentimes it's more like market factors
Yeah.
that drive the types of discussions that happen at conferences, because people are more interested, astrologers or astrology enthusiasts are more interested in learning techniques that they can use to apply to their own birth chart or to the charts of clients than they are typically in hearing about tests of astrology or statistical analysis of astrology, and lectures like that tend to be far less, to attract less, and therefore to not be featured as much. And that's also a major shift, I feel like, in the astrological community in the past few decades.
Yeah. I mean, astrology is market-driven largely, and it spills into the conferences. You have to have, a topic that's going to draw people, because then that brings in more people to the conference, and that allows the conference committee to pay for the expenses of having a trade show and all that. That's just how it works right now. That's how it's going. I mean, I think that the organizations have had their challenges. They still seem to be going fairly well. They have certification programs. NCGR has an old certification program that is separate from NCGR now that I'm involved with. That's one of my feet in astrology is in that. It's called Professional Astrologers Alliance. And, there's an effort to update the exams, and it's geared off Ken Negus's vision of a 4-year college program in astrology. So level 1, there's an exam, and that it assumes that you have, it's your freshman year. And there are equivalencies. Like if you go through the Kepler program and you get their certificate, you automatically qualify for levels 1, 2, and 3. It's like you have your freshman, sophomore, and junior year completed. And then the senior year is more like, you do your own report, and there are different requirements for that. But it's something, the organizations are doing something, and I think without them, astrology would be more impoverished. They play a role, and so do the schools, Kepler College and IAA, and there are a few others, and they are the organizations and the schools are right now all the institutions that they comprise the institutions that astrology has. They're not much, and they don't, and they're mostly volunteers, you point out, but they're what we got.
Yeah, they're what we got for sure. I'm curious how that's going to grow and evolve, and what steps could be taken to improve some of those things. And I do feel like there's a struggle to maintain relevancy of them to a certain extent amongst the younger generation of astrologers who hasn't seen as much about why they should become involved in those things or what the benefit or advantage is. So that's something that's kind of going on as a generational thing right now, where it was more necessary 30 years ago. Like those mailing lists, for example, that the astrological organizations put out, that's where you heard about what was going on in the community. But nowadays you hear what's going on in the community more so through social media and things like that. So that's why I'm saying there's sometimes an attempt to reinvent themselves or to understand what their relevancy can be in the modern period, where some of those things have shifted a little bit.
Yeah, I think that the organizations which were formed in a time where there was no internet, need to adjust to the internet. I mean, that's what happens. If you're born in it, my son is 35 years old. He knows exactly how to work in that world. I'm older. I've figured it out enough to get by, but I'm, no expert. If I had to market myself as an astrologer right now, I would have to do a lot of work. I would have to, put a lot into it. So it is. Right. It's a different medium, and the organizations, are using it. They're not using it, entirely. I think that there are other factors involved too. If you're a libertarian, you don't really want a group. You just kind of want to operate on your own. And I think that the organizations represent a kind of, a social responsibility aspect. Not that they all deliver it, but it comes out of a group model. Like we're all in it together. So again, it does reinforce the astrological bubble in some ways. But it also provides a community, where information can be shared and that's focused around something. Those two organizations, ESAR and NCGR, they were originally focused around research, as you point out, and now the research is too hard to do, and nobody's qualified to do it. So what are they? They're a social group of some sort. They're a social group that brings together amateurs, people who love the subject, and some professionals. And, I think you're absolutely right. There is a search for relevance and meaning as time goes on. We'll see how that unfolds.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that both of them have research in their titles, but that research and what that means is not the same as when they were set up in the 1970s and 80s, I think is a good example of that shift. One thing I wanted to make sure I ask you about is a term and a phrase that you use like multiple times throughout the book that I always associate with you, and I always thought it was like one of the best phrases ever, is for a birth chart, you call it a time slice, or for an astrological chart, you call it a time slice.
It is.
What does that mean, or could you expand on that? Yeah,
well, first of all, I don't like the use of the word horoscope for a chart, because I don't think it's quite that accurate. As I understand it, it means like view of the hour, right?
It's like hour marker.
Hour marker. So it probably refer more to the ascendant, I would think.
Yeah, it originally meant the ascendant in the first house.
In the history of trigonometry, the challenge of calculating the ascendant goes down as like one of the biggest things ever. I mean, that's what they were going for. They were going for that ascendant, that horoscope. Anyway, I don't think I think the word's been ruined by all these newspaper columns and so on. So I prefer to call it a birth chart. But the birth chart itself is a photograph of the sky. And, if you're in the northern hemisphere, you're looking south. East is to your left and west is to your right. It's a shot. It's so it's a time slice.
Snapshot.
It's a snapshot or a time slice, because that's what a time snapshot is. And it's a term that's used in the sciences. In geoscience, I've heard it used there, but I think there are a few other places. But it makes the most sense to me. I see it as one of the two primary techniques that is subject of astrology.
It's like something is right there. That's something we need to have. I really want to go to that though. So yeah. All right, let me go. See if I have any See what I can. Alright, let's try this again. I'm trying to see if I can get there even faster. Because I don't want to like have to go through all, but I'm pretty far from it, so I probably will have to watch this be an icicle land. Looks like icicle. Or maybe it's a sand place? I'll probably end up using all of these. Alright, one more. Alright. Woohoo! I made it. What's up with the slime? Yeah, there, help me. Slugs fell upon me so suddenly. I could wash it away if only I had some water. Okay, so I need water. So the reason why I can't go in there is it needs water. Oh wait, is this the splash fruit? Can we use it on our thing and get rid of it then? Let's try it. See what happens. Because I think you can... Do you need it cook? Well, no, you wouldn't be able to cook with something to put it on something. Alright, let's try... Oh, okay. So I need to help this guy. Oh, I can throw it. Okay. You saved me. Thank you. I was shameful this should have happened to me. Captain the guarded Zora's domain. Unbelievable. Ugh. After the upheaval, the filth suddenly began falling from the sky. They soiled the waters around here, and in Zora's domain, everyone's at their wits' end because of it. That's why I set out to investigate the surrounding area myself, to think I would fall prey for falling slug myself. Just thinking of it makes my scales bristle. My skills. My gills still feel so uncleaned. If you hadn't not sprayed me with water, I shudder to think what would have happened to me. Please take this to Zora's Spear as a token of my thanks. I'm sorry that it's not much, but it's all I have. They hate all the other weapons at the time of the upheaval, but well, if it's not unusable at least. Oh, I ended up... Poor guy. I felt bad for him. That sucks. I was just simply trying to get this. Because I was trying to find a fast way to go here to unlock... I was going to take advantage of that sky tone. I'm going to definitely make more, stamina meters, so that way I can just keep doing that. And of course, yeah, have the ability to do that. So, yeah, so we'll listen to it once we, get this. But yeah, we're almost actually over halfway done with the nature astrology. I definitely will try to save what we've listened to and stuff. But I really like this podcast because it really does go into touch why we haven't really disproven skeptics in general, if that makes sense. What is that right there? All I know is that there's another area over there, and if we can... That way we can at least get the phenomenons all situated. Oh yeah, look at that. Everything's pretty good. All right. I am curious about what this is, so... Oh, it's a shrine. I didn't know that. How many shrines have I found? 1. Wow, that's cool. This. Holy crap, this is so cool. All right, y'all. We'll go back to listening. Sorry, but that was fun. I'm gonna turn off back real quick so we can listen.
Employs in as analyzing self-organizing systems that are subject matter, the time slice, and the cycle.
Geoscience, is that what you think?
I may have, I'm trying to think where else I may have gotten it from. Philosophy, I'm not sure.
Because that actually makes sense, because I'm thinking of like sometimes when you drive through the mountains here in Denver, like a highway that they've cut through a mountain, sometimes you'll drive through and on the side you'll just see the different layers of sediment, and you realize that you're seeing, stuff that built up over hundreds and thousands and millions of years, but that one of those little layers, is what you're talking about, is a time slice.
Yeah, you see that in marine cores and ice cores, where you're looking for the history of the atmosphere and the oceans, so you have a core and you slice it at some point, and since you're measuring time and what was going on in those times, you can call it a time slice. But it's a good question. I've been using it for a long time, and I probably got it from Geosciences, but I'm not positive. I may have run across it in some other... Anyway, it stuck with me. I just thought it made the most sense. This is what we're doing. As astrologers, we're analyzing a time slice calculated for a moment of that, a tipping point of some sort, transition point, a bifurcation is the word I use in the book often. But we also use cycles. And in the past in astrology, those were called revolutions. Cycles of Jupiter and Saturn, things like that. It's kind of a broad use for the term revolution, wouldn't you say? Because, you can use it, but it's not a hard, you're not talking about time slices or charts with revolutions, except when something crosses say the vernal equinox.
Yeah, revolution. It's just going back to the original meaning of that, which is a return to something, or for a cycle to be completed, and for something to come back to where it started.
Yeah, so it's like it's kind of like a cycles thing. So I would say astrology analyzes time slices and cycles. And those are the two main approaches.
And I love that. And there's something really important there about the phrasing it as a time slice that gets to the heart of sort of the title of your book, what is the nature of astrology? But when you conceptualize let's just say a birth chart, for the sake of argument, instead of generalizing an astrological chart, but you're taking something where time is always flowing, and you have like a start point, like point A, and then eventually it flows to point B. But it's like a continuous process that never stops moving, and the planets always keep moving in their orbits and their cycles and their movements through the solar system. But then at the moment of a birth chart, you freeze that and you take a snapshot of that moment in time and where the planets are placed relative to each other in their orbits. And there's something about that slice of time then that becomes important for describing the nature of what happened in that moment as well as its future, essentially.
Yeah, because the time slice shows where you are amongst all the various cycles that are going on, all the revolutions, right? And so, the astrology has developed all sorts of techniques to unpack information stored that way in the time slice.
Right. So
Like aspects, like applying and separating, that would be like one obvious approach.
So that, and that's fundamental to your conceptualization of the nature of astrology and what it is, that it's the study of those time slices within the context of self-organizing systems like humans, but also other self-organizing systems on Earth.
Yeah, there could be, non-human animals. You could do charts for gorillas.
Yeah, I think you actually cited a study at some point that somebody had done about dogs.
Dogs,
and
yeah, right.
different types of dogs that had different measurable, not just their personalities in a weird sense or in like a human sense, but in the terms of like their like different dogs have more aggressive personalities or different things like that, and that somebody had tried to study that.
Yeah, the breeders write down the personalities of the dogs, because the buyers want to know that. And what's her name? It's a French hyphenated name. I can't think of it off the top of my head right now, but she wrote a number of scientific papers that related astrology to biology, and they're very good. And she did one with the dogs, and it's basically a replication of Falkland, except using dogs. Because it tracks the diurnal cycle, correlating with the personality of the dogs.
So the point there would be like your view that there's something universal about astrology and how it works, that it doesn't just have to be applied to humans, even though it's most commonly done in that context with birth charts, but that astrological charts or time slices can be applied to other living entities that have a life cycle or like a temporal component to their existence.
Yeah, and things that are not living, things like, decisions or, electional astrology, you compute your own time slice, when you want to make a move. But there is a tendency in astrology to be very anthropocentric, and I think that's not good. In general, I think that's a bad thing. I think that humans got to get out of that. That's the equivalent of like the Earth is in the center of the solar system. It's like humans are in the center of the solar system.
The application of that to electional and horary astrology was the part that I was like the most uncertain about in terms of the extension of some of the causal arguments to astrology and how that would work, because that's the point where astrology starts to be much more abstract and symbolic and sort of removed from the more like biological considerations that might be more relevant when we're talking about like humans or dogs or what have you.
Yeah, well, the subject of higher order systems, self-organizing systems, which would include personality, the mind, group behaviors, and so on, it's pretty new. We don't know a lot about it, and I try to explain some of it in the last chapter, and then show how that information could be very relevant to explaining horary and electional astrology. But I mentioned a number of authors there, and if somebody was really interested, they could see that papers are being published on it. The philosophers talk about emergence, and so do scientists. It's a new area. I think I mentioned somewhere that I think it's as radical as quantum mechanics, except that it just hasn't gained traction because it's spread out among a whole bunch of disciplines.
Yeah, one point that you started getting to that I thought was really interesting that might be at the core of it and could perhaps be developed more at some point is it almost seemed like you were saying at one point that anything that has any self-organizing system that has a bifurcation at some point, that to the extent that you can cast a chart or a time slice for that moment of bifurcation or that moment where something in its existence meets a a fork in the road where it can go one direction or another, that the analysis of that temporal moment in time is anything that experiences that you can use astrology to analyze that, both that temporal moment in time as well as project it out into the future.
Yeah, you can see its trajectory. Yeah, it's almost reminiscent of, Lorenz, the butterfly effect guy. He found out that if he put all these, this information about weather, to model it, and he found that if he changed the starting point, the results were completely different. So that's like a kind of analogy to what happens in astrology. You have this starting point. In the case of people, it's the transition from water breathing to air breathing, and separation from the mothership. So it's a bifurcation point, a big shift and change. You look at that time slice, and then you got a good sense of where things are going. But it could have been at a different time, and things would be different.
Yes, to me that gets into some really important things, because it starts to become more about, the study of astrology starts to become more about the nature of time, or there's something there that starts getting to the mechanism of underlying astrology being something much broader that has to do with time, the nature of time, and the role that time plays in our experience of reality or in nature. That's hard to articulate, but it was something you were starting to point to there that seemed very important towards the end of the book.
Yeah, I really, there's so many unanswered questions, but yeah, there's, what is really going on in astrology is going to require a lot more knowledge than we have right now about things like time and about things like internal time. I bring up ideas about imprinting, in cases of human development. The planet's timing windows of imprint vulnerability, and basically encoding certain kind of patterns, and that they relate to the planets, some of the inner planets. I don't say that that's an explanation for all of astrology. But that's kind of where things might be going. I do state pretty clearly that I think that a lot of astrology might be explainable, maybe not, maybe not right now. There needs to be more work done in some of the other sciences, and that this is, the present moment in some ways is like poor John Goad trying to do his study of astrometeorology in the middle of the 17th century and not having access to reliable thermometers and barometers and weather vanes. And actually had that, hygrometers, all sorts of, instrumentation. I mean, modern science is based on instrumentation, which produces units that you can do reductionist science with. He also didn't have statistics. He just had, he had averages, more or less, that sort of thing. So I think astrology today is at a similar point. We just don't have the science. We have the beginnings, I think, of the science of self-organizing systems. We have the beginnings of that. But I think that astrology as a field should pay more attention to that and should define itself as a subject. Whether it doesn't have the institutional power to fund research and theory, it should just be more aware of it. Whether the internet is going to be able to bring that to enough people or enough people to get it, I don't know. But, I think astrology will survive as a subject, but I think it could do a lot better if there was a little more awareness that it's not limited to practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think after reading your book, I think it's up there on the level of Cosmos and Psyche in terms of important discussions about the nature of astrology that will be very impactful on the next generation of astrologers. And it doesn't have the same aim as Cosmos and Psyche in that your book is not trying to prove astrology or necessarily demonstrate its validity through case studies or something like that, or examples, but it's trying to explain astrology and where it's at now and how it got there, how it got here, and to present that to a more intellectual audience in order to give people a sort of like heads up about the subject and what the deal is with it, as well as some statements about where it might head in the future and how the trajectory of astrology might be improved so that astrology might be improved in society at some point in the future.
Yeah.